Welcome to Final Curiosity. Today's story uncovers a truth hidden for more than 150 years. It is the story of Ada Coleman, an enslaved girl in 1868 whose remarkable memory helped solve crimes and exposed a secret system that kept boys and girls enslaved well into the 1940s. What you are about to hear was never meant to be known. This story is intense and difficult. Take a breath, listen closely, and let these voices from the past finally be heard. Before we start, subscribe to the channel and comment below which city and country you're listening from. Your participation helps ensure these stories are remembered, not buried. Let's begin. Look carefully at this photograph from 1932. A young black girl, no older than 8, stands in the middle of a Mississippi cotton field. Her hands are rough. Her back is bent. Her eyes hold a weight no child should ever carry. Now, here is the question that changes everything you thought you knew about American history. Slavery was abolished in 1865. So why, 67 years later, was this child still working in the fields exactly as her great-grandmother had under slavery? The answer is a secret America buried for over 150 years. And today, we are going to uncover it. When Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1, 1863, the nation believed a new era had dawned. When the 13th Amendment was ratified on December 6, 1865, the words were clear: neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States. 4 million enslaved people were finally free. Families torn apart for generations could reunite. Parents could hold their children without fear. The chains were broken. The nightmare was over. At least, that's what the history books told us. But across the small towns and sprawling plantations of the American South, a different story was unfolding. A story that would stay hidden for generations. A story of children stolen from their parents in broad daylight. Not by criminals, but by the law itself. A story of boys and girls declared free by the Constitution, yet enslaved by a system so cunning, so perfectly designed, it operated in plain sight for nearly a century. This is the story of the apprenticeship system. This is the story America never wanted you to know. To understand what happened after slavery, we must first understand what slavery meant to the Southern economy. Before the Civil War, enslaved people were not just workers. They were the foundation of an entire way of life. In 1860, the total value of enslaved people in the United States was about $3.5 billion. To put that in perspective, that amount was greater than the value of all the railroads and factories in the entire nation combined. Enslaved people were the single largest financial asset in America. When slavery ended, white plantation owners didn't just lose their workers. They lost their wealth. They lost their power. They lost everything that defined them. And they were not about to accept that without a fight. In the spring of 1865, as Confederate soldiers returned home defeated, the white planter class faced a crisis like never before. The question was simple but terrifying: who would work the fields now? Who would pick the cotton, harvest the tobacco, cook the meals and clean the houses, all the work enslaved people had done for 250 years. The formerly enslaved were now free to leave, free to demand wages, free to say no. For the first time in American history, black people had choices. And that terrified the white South more than anything. Within months of the war's end, white politicians across the former Confederacy began meeting in secret. They gathered in courthouses and plantation homes, in state legislatures and private clubs. They had one goal: find a legal way to keep black people in chains. Not literally. The 13th Amendment prevented that. But there had to be another way. A loophole, a legal trick, a system that would let them continue using black labor without calling it slavery. And they found it. They called it the Black Codes. The Black Codes were a series of laws passed in southern states starting in late 1865. Mississippi was first, passing its codes in November of that year. South Carolina followed immediately, then Alabama, Louisiana, Florida, Georgia, and the rest. Each state had slightly different laws, but all shared the same purpose: to control the newly freed black population and force them back to work on the plantations. These codes were clever in their cruelty. They gave black people certain rights, just enough to claim slavery wasn't being reestablished. Black people could now legally marry. They could own certain property. They could make contracts and testify in court, but only in cases involving other black people. These were crumbs thrown from the table to create the illusion of freedom. But hidden within these codes was poison, a provision that would destroy black families for generations. Hidden within was the apprenticeship system. Here's how the apprenticeship laws worked. If a black child was an orphan, or if a local court decided the child's parents were unfit or unable to provide for them, that child could be taken by the state and bound as an apprentice to a white employer. The employer would receive the child's labor in exchange for supposedly teaching them a trade and providing food, clothing, and shelter. The child would remain bound until adulthood, usually 18 for girls, 21 for boys. The entire time the child would receive no wages, not a penny. Now, here is where the system showed its true evil. Who decided if black parents were unfit? White judges. Who were these judges? In most cases, former Confederate soldiers and plantation owners. They were friends and relatives of the very people who wanted black labor, the same men who had owned slaves months before. And what standard did they use to decide if black parents could provide? Whatever standard they wanted. A black family could be living in a solid home, working steady jobs, taking perfect care of their children, and still have those children taken, simply because a white judge said so. But the system went deeper. The Black Codes included something called former master preference. This meant when a black child was taken and bound as an apprentice, their former enslaver had the first right to claim them. Think about that. A child enslaved on a plantation until 1865 could be declared an orphan, or the child of unfit parents in 1866, and handed right back to the same enslaver. Same plantation, same work, same conditions. The only difference was the paperwork. The case of Oni Cunningham shows exactly how this system operated. On November 21, 1865, just 2 weeks after Mississippi passed its Black Codes, a contract of indenture was issued by the Freedmen's Bureau itself. This contract bound Oni Cunningham, described as a free girl of color, to a man named Alex Cunningham. Oni was 9 years old. The contract stated she would learn the art of housekeeping until she turned 18. 9 years of unpaid labor, 9 years of servitude, 9 years of stolen childhood, and the man she was bound to shared her last name, because he was almost certainly her former owner. This was not an apprenticeship. This was slavery with different paperwork. But Oni Cunningham was not alone. Across the South, thousands of children were being taken. In Maryland, the situation was especially severe. Maryland had a long history of using apprenticeship laws, and white plantation owners there moved quickly to exploit the system. Between September 1865 and September 1867, the Freedmen's Bureau apprenticed hundreds of black children. Some were infants, others teenagers. Some were bound to learn skilled trades, but many were bound simply to serve as apprentices or servants. The word servant was a thin disguise for what they really meant: slave. In Russell County, Alabama, a man named Nathan Cox and his wife Jenny had survived slavery together. They had children. They had hope. When freedom came in 1865, they believed they could finally live as a family without fear. But their former master, a man named Francis Jones, had other plans. Within weeks of the 13th Amendment's ratification, Jones went to the local court. He told the judge Nathan and Jenny Cox were unable to care for their children. The judge, a friend of Jones, agreed. The Cox children were taken and bound as apprentices to Francis Jones, the same man who had enslaved them, the same plantation where they had been born into bondage. Nathan and Jenny Cox fought back. They went to the courts. They filed petitions. They begged for their children to be returned. But the system was designed to work against them. The judges were former Confederates. The lawyers were plantation owners. The entire legal apparatus of Alabama was controlled by the same people who had benefited from slavery. Every petition was denied. Every appeal rejected. The Cox children remained enslaved in all but name, working the same fields as before the war, receiving nothing for their labor. Nathan and Jenny Cox never got their children back. The case of Violet Maples reveals another layer of the system's cruelty. Violet was an enslaved woman on a southern plantation. She had several children, including one whose father was her white enslaver. When freedom came, Violet's dream was simple: gather her children and her brothers and start a new life together as a family. But that dream was destroyed almost immediately. Her former master used the apprenticeship laws to keep her children. When Violet tried to reclaim them, she faced an impossible obstacle. Under slavery, black marriages were not legally recognized. So in the eyes of the law, Violet was an unmarried woman, and unmarried black women were routinely labeled loose women or woman of bad character. This label was then used as proof they were unfit mothers. Violet's children were kept from her, not because she was a bad mother, but because the system was designed to punish her for a marriage that slavery itself had refused to recognize. What made this system especially insidious was how it used the language of charity and benevolence. White plantation owners didn't say they were re-enslaving black children. They said they were helping them. They claimed black parents couldn't provide. They claimed black children needed white guidance to learn valuable skills. They claimed apprenticeship was good for black families. The whole system was wrapped in words of care and concern while committing acts of profound violence. The historical record shows exactly what these apprenticeships taught. One court document from the period lists the skills black children would supposedly learn. For boys, it was usually farming. For girls, housekeeping. Farming meant picking cotton, harvesting tobacco, clearing land. All the back-breaking work enslaved people had always done. Housekeeping meant cooking, cleaning, caring for white children. All the domestic work enslaved women had always done. There was no education, no training in valuable trades, no preparation for independent life. There was only work, endless, unpaid work. The Freedmen's Bureau was supposed to protect black families. This federal agency was created by Congress in March 1865, specifically to help formerly enslaved people transition to freedom. Bureau agents were stationed across the South. They were supposed to ensure black people were treated fairly, that their rights were protected, that families stayed together. But the Bureau was overwhelmed and underfunded. There were never enough agents to monitor what was happening, and in many cases, the agents themselves were complicit in the apprenticeship system. They signed the contracts. They approved the indentures. They handed black children over to white employers. The very agency created to protect freedom became a tool for continuing slavery. By 1866, the scope of this crisis was becoming clear. Thousands of black children across the South had been taken from their parents. Entire communities were torn apart. Black newspapers and churches raised the alarm. Frederick Douglass spoke out against the system. Abolitionists who had fought for years to end slavery were horrified to see it returning in a new form. Congress responded by passing the Civil Rights Act of 1866, meant to give black people more legal protections. But in the South, these federal laws meant little. Local courts simply ignored them. White judges kept taking black children. White employers kept using black labor without pay. The system continued. What the apprenticeship system revealed was a fundamental truth about slavery. Slavery was never just about legal ownership of human beings. It was about control. It was about power. It was about forcing people to work for nothing. And as long as you could achieve those goals, it didn't matter what you called it. You could call it apprenticeship. You could call it training. You could call it charity. As long as black children worked without pay, as long as black families were torn apart, as long as black people had no real power to resist, slavery continued. The chains were invisible, but just as strong. The apprenticeship system was just one part of a larger strategy. The black codes included many other provisions designed to control black labor. Vagrancy laws made it illegal for black people to be unemployed. If a black man couldn't prove he had a job, he could be arrested, fined, and forced to work without pay. Labor contract laws required black workers to sign year-long contracts with white employers at the start of each year. If they left early, they could be arrested and forced back. If they were late, their wages could be docked. If they talked back, they could be whipped. Anti-enticement laws made it illegal for anyone to offer a black worker a better job. This meant even if a black person found an employer willing to pay more, they couldn't accept without risking arrest. Together, these laws created a web of control that made true freedom almost impossible. A black family in the South faced an impossible choice: sign exploitative contracts and work for almost nothing, or refuse and be arrested as vagrants. Their children could be taken at any moment. If a white judge decided they were unfit, they couldn't leave for better opportunities. Anti-enticement laws prevented it. They couldn't vote. Most states hadn't given black people that right yet. They couldn't serve on juries. They couldn't testify against white people in court. They were free in name only. In every practical sense, they were still enslaved. The response from black communities was remarkable. Despite overwhelming obstacles, black parents fought desperately to reclaim their children. They traveled hundreds of miles to file petitions. They hired lawyers when they could. They appealed to the Freedmen's Bureau. They wrote letters to newspapers. They organized through their churches. They did everything in their power to reunite their families. The records of the Freedmen's Bureau are filled with heartbreaking petitions from black parents begging for their children back. These documents give voice to people history tried to silence. They reveal a depth of love and determination no system could fully destroy. One petition from a black mother in North Carolina tells the story in her own words. She describes how her children were taken just months after freedom. She describes the employer who took them, a man known for his cruelty during slavery. She describes her attempts to see her children, blocked at every turn. She begs the Bureau for help. She begs for justice. We don't know if she ever got her children back, but her words survive. Her voice reaches across 150 years to remind us these were real people, real families, real children. Not statistics, not abstractions. Human beings who loved, suffered, and fought for their freedom. The legal battles over apprenticeship reached state supreme courts. In Maryland, a case called Vreers in Turner became one of the most important challenges to the system. A black woman named Elizabeth Turner had been bound as an apprentice after the war. She argued the apprenticeship was illegal because it violated the Civil Rights Act. The case eventually reached Chief Justice of the United States, Supreme Court Salmon P. Chase, who was riding circuit in Maryland. Chase ruled in Elizabeth Turner's favor. He declared Maryland's apprenticeship laws a violation of federal law. It was a significant victory, but not enough. Despite the ruling, enforcement was nearly impossible. Local courts across the South kept binding black children as apprentices. The law had spoken, but power lay with those who ignored it. By the time Reconstruction began in earnest, the apprenticeship system was already deeply entrenched. Radical Republicans in Congress tried to dismantle the black codes. They passed the 14th Amendment, guaranteeing equal protection under the law. They passed the 15th Amendment, giving black men the right to vote. They sent federal troops to the South to enforce these new rights. For a brief moment, real change seemed possible. Black men were elected to state legislatures and even to Congress. Black families began to build wealth and community. Schools were established. Churches flourished. This period, 1867 to 1877, represented the greatest expansion of black freedom since the nation's founding. But the forces of white supremacy never stopped fighting. Organizations like the Ku Klux Klan launched campaigns of terror against black families. White mobs attacked black voters. Black politicians were assassinated. Black schools were burned. And in the background, the economic systems that kept black people in bondage continued to evolve. The apprenticeship system adapted. When federal attention was high, white employers used other methods. When attention waned, they returned to the old ways. The children kept working. The families kept suffering. The system kept turning. In 1877, everything changed. The presidential election of 1876 was disputed. Republican Rutherford B. Hayes and Democrat Samuel Tilden both claimed victory. To resolve the crisis, a secret deal was made. Hayes would become president, but in exchange, federal troops would be withdrawn from the South. Reconstruction was over. The federal government abandoned black people to their fate. Within years, white supremacist governments retook power across the South. The gains of Reconstruction were systematically destroyed, and the systems of control that had operated secretly during Reconstruction now operated openly. The end of Reconstruction did not end the apprenticeship system. It simply allowed it to operate with complete impunity. Without federal oversight, no one challenged the local courts. Without federal troops, no one protected black families. The taking of black children continued into the 1880s and 1890s. It continued into the new century. The system didn't truly begin to decline until the Child Welfare Act of 1919. And even then, exemptions for agricultural labor meant black children on farms remained unprotected. The Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 finally banned most child labor in factories and mines. But agricultural labor was specifically exempted. And where did most black children in the South work? On farms. In fields. Picking cotton and tobacco, just as their ancestors had during slavery. This brings us back to that photograph from 1932. That little girl in the cotton field was no accident. She was no exception. She was the product of a system that had operated for nearly 70 years. A system that used the language of law and charity to steal children from their parents. A system that used the power of the courts to force children into unpaid labor. A system that operated in plain sight while the rest of America looked away. Her great-grandmother might have been enslaved before 1865. Her grandmother might have been taken as an apprentice after the war. Her mother might have been trapped in debt peonage or sharecropping. And she, in 1932, was still in the fields. 4 generations. 70 years after abolition. Still not free. The apprenticeship system was just the beginning. It was the first tool white Southerners used to maintain slavery after slavery had been legally abolished. But it was not the last. The same impulse that created apprenticeship also created convict leasing. This system used the loophole in the 13th Amendment, which allowed slavery as punishment for crime, to create a new form of bondage. Black people were arrested for minor, often fabricated offenses. They were convicted in sham trials. They were leased to private companies and forced to work in mines, factories, and plantations. The conditions were often worse than slavery. An enslaved person before the war was valuable property to be protected. A convict laborer after the war was expendable. If one died, there were always more. The same impulse also created debt peonage. Under this system, black workers were trapped in cycles of debt they could never escape. They'd borrow money from a landowner for seeds, tools, and supplies. At harvest, they'd sell their crops to the same landowner, who set the prices. Somehow, the amount they owed was always more than the value of their crops. They ended each year deeper in debt. And because they owed money, they couldn't leave. If they tried, they could be arrested and forced back. Generation after generation was trapped, working land they'd never own, creating wealth they'd never share. The history of black children in America after slavery is a history of stolen futures. It is a history of potential never allowed to develop. Every child who spent their youth picking cotton instead of learning to read was a loss. Every child separated from loving parents was a tragedy. Every child who worked without pay while white children went to school was an injustice. And these injustices didn't end when the children grew up. They passed down through generations. The grandmother who couldn't read couldn't help her grandchildren with schoolwork. The family that never accumulated wealth couldn't pass anything down. The trauma of separation and exploitation became part of the family story, shaping lives for generations. Historian Mary Frances Berry spent years tracing the family trees of children taken under the apprenticeship system. Her research, published in her book, Slavery After Slavery's 2025, reveals the intergenerational impact. She followed families from 1865 to the present. She documented how the theft of children's labor after the war created ripples still felt today. Families torn apart in 1866 still deal with the consequences. Wealth stolen through unpaid labor was never recovered. Educational opportunities denied could never be reclaimed. The damage was not temporary. It was permanent and ongoing. What makes this history so difficult is how thoroughly it was buried. Most Americans have never heard of the apprenticeship system. It isn't taught in most schools. It doesn't appear in most history books. The black codes themselves are often mentioned briefly, then passed over as if they were a minor inconvenience. Not a systematic attempt to re-enslave 4 million people. The focus is almost always on the 13th Amendment as a moment of liberation, rather than on the decades of struggle that followed. This erasure is not accidental. It serves a purpose. If Americans don't know what happened after slavery, they can't understand why inequality persists today. If Americans believe slavery truly ended in 1865, they can tell themselves black people have had the same opportunities as everyone else for 160 years. The truth is far more complicated. The truth is freedom was not given. It was fought for. And in many ways, that fight continues. We have now reached the end of the first part of this story. But we are far from finished. In the second part, we will go deeper into the systems that evolved from apprenticeship. We will explore convict leasing, which scholars have called worse than slavery. We will examine debt peonage and sharecropping, which trapped millions in cycles of poverty. We will follow the story through the 20th century to the moment these systems finally began to crumble. And we will ask the question America has avoided for too long. What do we owe to the descendants of these children? What does justice look like after 150 years of injustice? The story is not over. It is only beginning. The year is 1868. A black man named Samuel Johnson walks down a dirt road in rural Georgia. He has committed no crime. He has stolen nothing. He has hurt no one. He is simply walking. But a white sheriff stops him. The sheriff asks Samuel for his labor contract. Samuel doesn't have one. He has been looking for work, trying to find a fair employer who will pay decent wages. The sheriff arrests him on the spot. The charge is vagrancy. Samuel is taken before a judge, convicted within minutes, and sentenced to pay a fine he cannot afford. Because he can't pay, he is leased to a mining company. He will spend the next 5 years underground digging coal in conditions so brutal that 1 in 4 convict laborers will die. Samuel Johnson was a free man under the Constitution. But the Constitution could not save him from what was coming. The convict leasing system emerged directly from the same impulse that created the apprenticeship laws. When the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, it included a single exception. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist, except as a punishment for crime. Those 8 words created a loophole large enough to drive the entire Southern economy through. If slavery was legal as punishment for crime, the solution was simple: make everything a crime. Make walking without a labor contract a crime. Make being unemployed a crime. Make speaking loudly near a white woman a crime. Make looking at a white person the wrong way a crime. Then arrest black people by the thousands. Convict them in courts controlled by former Confederates, and lease their labor to private companies. Slavery would continue, just through the criminal justice system. Between 1866 and 1869, Alabama, Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, Georgia, Mississippi, and Florida all began leasing convicts to private employers. The system spread rapidly because it was profitable for everyone involved, except the prisoners. States received money for leasing out convicts. Companies received cheap labor they didn't have to pay, house, or feed adequately. Former plantation owners, who often ran these companies, received workers who could not leave, complain, or resist. Everyone profited from black suffering. That was the genius of the system. It transformed human misery into economic growth. The conditions under convict leasing were worse than anything during slavery. That might seem impossible. Slavery was brutal beyond description. But there was one crucial difference. During slavery, an enslaved person was property. They had monetary value. A slaveholder who killed an enslaved person lost an investment worth hundreds or thousands of dollars. There was a twisted economic incentive to keep them alive and able to work. Under convict leasing, that incentive disappeared. A convict laborer was leased for a fixed term. If that laborer died, the company simply requested another. There was no cost to working people to death, and so they did. Mortality rates were staggering. In some labor camps, nearly half of all prisoners died within a year. They died in coal mines from cave-ins and explosions. They died in turpentine camps from exposure and disease. They died in railroad construction from exhaustion and accidents. They died on plantations from beatings and starvation. The death rate among convict laborers was sometimes 10 times higher than the death rate among enslaved people before the war. Freedom had brought not liberation, but a new form of horror, in many ways more deadly than what came before. Children were not spared. The vagrancy laws and black codes had no minimum age. A black child of 12 or 13 could be arrested for vagrancy, convicted, and leased out just like an adult. They worked alongside grown men in mines and fields. They suffered the same brutality. They faced the same deadly conditions. And because they were smaller and weaker, they often died even faster. The records are incomplete. No one kept careful count of how many children entered the system. They weren't considered important enough to document, but from scattered reports and survivor testimonies, we know children were there, in the mines, in the turpentine camps, dying alongside their fathers, brothers, and uncles. The story of Green Cottenham illustrates how this system destroyed families across generations. Green Cottenham was a black man living in Alabama in the early 1900s. In March 1908, he was arrested in a small town called Columbiana. The charge was vagrancy. Green had done nothing wrong. He was simply a black man without paperwork proving he had a job. He was convicted and fined. When he couldn't pay, he was sentenced to hard labor. He was leased to a coal mining company, Tennessee Coal, Iron and Railroad Company. The conditions in the mines were nightmarish. Men worked in near total darkness. The air was thick with coal dust. Cave-ins were common. Disease spread rapidly through cramped, filthy quarters. Green Cottenham entered those mines a healthy young man. Within a year, he was dead. His crime was being black and poor in Alabama. His sentence was death. Green Cottenham's story was researched and told by journalist Douglas A. Blackman in his book, Slavery by Another Name, which won the Pulitzer Prize in 2009. Blackman traced not just Green's story, but thousands like him. He documented how convict leasing operated as a form of neo-slavery lasting from the Civil War's end until the 1940s. 80 years. Nearly a century of bondage after abolition. Blackman's research showed the system was not hidden. It was openly discussed in newspapers and government reports. Politicians debated its merits. Businessmen calculated its profits. Everyone knew what was happening. But because the victims were black, no one with power cared enough to stop it. Convict leasing eventually ended. Not from moral awakening, but because it became economically inefficient and politically embarrassing. As the 20th century progressed, southern states began building their own prison farms and chain gangs. They realized they could keep the profits of convict labor for themselves, instead of sharing with private companies. Alabama was one of the last states to formally end convict leasing in 1928. But the exploitation of prison labor didn't end. It simply changed form. Chain gangs continued into the 1950s and beyond. Prison farms operated well into the 20th century. The system evolved, but its fundamental nature remained black labor, extracted through the criminal justice system, with little or no compensation, under brutality and coercion. While convict leasing captured black men and boys in one trap, another system captured entire families. This system was sharecropping, and it worked hand in hand with debt peonage to create a bondage that would last generations. Sharecropping emerged almost immediately after the Civil War. The basic arrangement seemed simple. A black family would farm a portion of a white landowner's property. In exchange, they'd give the landowner a share of the crops, usually between half and 2/3. The family kept the rest. In theory, it was a fair exchange. The landowner provided land, often tools and seeds. The family provided labor. Both shared risk and reward. In practice, the system was designed to keep black families in permanent debt and permanent servitude. The trap worked like this. At the start of each year, a sharecropping family needed supplies: seeds to plant, tools to work, food to eat until harvest, clothes to wear. Where would they get these things? They had no money, no savings. Everything they owned during slavery belonged to their enslavers. They started freedom with nothing. The only option was to borrow from the landowner or a local merchant, often the same person or someone connected to the landowner. The family received credit for seeds, tools, food, and clothing. The cost was recorded in a ledger kept by the lender. Interest was charged, often 50% or higher. At harvest, the family sold their crops. The proceeds first paid back the loan plus interest. Whatever remained, if anything, belonged to the family. The genius was that the black family almost never saw the ledger. They didn't know how much they owed. They didn't know the prices charged for supplies. They didn't know the interest rate. They simply knew what the landowner told them. And the landowner had every incentive to manipulate the numbers. If the family came out ahead, they might save money. They might eventually buy their own land. They might escape. But if they came out behind, if they ended the year owing more than they earned, they had to sign another contract for the next year. They had to keep working to pay off their debt. And somehow, miraculously, that debt never seemed to go away. Year after year, decade after decade, generation after generation, black families remained trapped on land they would never own, working for wealth they would never share. This was debt peonage. It was illegal under federal law passed in 1867, but that law was almost never enforced. White landowners knew they could keep black families in bondage through debt, and no one would stop them. The federal government looked away. State governments were run by the planter class that benefited. Local law enforcement worked for the landowners. If a black family tried to leave while they owed money, the sheriff would hunt them down and bring them back. They could be charged with fraud, theft, or breach of contract. They could be convicted and sent into convict leasing. The choice was stay and work, or be arrested and work under worse conditions. This was not freedom. This was slavery with extra steps. The children of sharecropping families did not go to school. They worked in the fields alongside their parents from the moment they could carry a sack. A 6-year-old could pick cotton. A 7-year-old could chop weeds. An 8-year-old could drive a mule. These children were not paid. Their labor was simply part of what the family owed. Every hour a child spent in the fields was an hour not spent learning to read. Every season of work was a season of education lost. By adulthood, these children had the same lack of education and options as their parents. They became sharecroppers themselves. They signed the same exploitative contracts. They fell into the same debt trap. The system reproduced itself generation after generation with terrible efficiency. Photographs taken by Lewis Hine and others in the early 20th century show us these children. We see their faces staring back across a century. A boy of 10 standing in a cotton field, his hands wrapped in rags against the sharp bowls. A girl of 8 sorting tobacco leaves, her eyes hollow with exhaustion. A family outside a ramshackle cabin, clothes patched and worn, futures already determined by the accident of their birth. These photographs were meant to shock Americans into action against child labor. They helped build support for reforms in factories and mines. But agricultural labor was exempt from most child labor laws. The children in the fields continued to work long after factory children were protected. And those children were disproportionately black. The Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 was supposed to be a landmark. It established minimum wage and maximum hours. It banned child labor in most industries. President Franklin Roosevelt called it the most far-reaching, far-sighted program for the benefit of workers ever adopted. But the law had a massive exception. Agricultural workers were excluded. Domestic workers were excluded. These were the 2 categories where black workers were most concentrated. Southern Democrats in Congress, holding enormous power due to seniority, refused to support any law disrupting the South's racial hierarchy. They demanded the exclusions as the price of their votes. Roosevelt agreed. The result was a law that protected white workers while leaving black workers exposed. The children of sharecroppers and farm laborers continued to work without protection well into the 1960s. We need to stop and understand something crucial. This was not ancient history. This was not a distant, unrecognizable past. People born into debt peonage and sharecropping are still alive today. The last person known to have been born into slavery, a man named Sylvester Magee, died in 1971. He claimed to have been born in 1841, which would have made him 130. Whether his exact age was accurate is debated. But what's certain is that living memory of slavery persisted well into the late 20th century. The children who worked those fields in the 1930s and 1940s are in their 80s and 90s now. Some are still alive. When we talk about this history, we're not talking about something that happened long ago to people we cannot know. We're talking about the grandparents and great-grandparents of people alive today. The system finally began to break down in the 1940s and 1950s, not from sudden commitment to justice, but because of the Great Migration. Between 1910 and 1970, 6 million Black Americans left the South for cities in the North, Midwest, and West. They left because they were tired of working land they could never own, tired of living in fear of white violence. They wanted their children to go to school and have opportunities the South would never provide. They left because they could. Railroads and highways made travel possible. Demand for labor in northern factories, especially during both World Wars, created jobs paying real wages. Black families packed what little they owned and headed north in one of the largest internal migrations in American history. The Great Migration devastated the Southern labor system. Landowners who grew wealthy on the backs of black sharecroppers suddenly found themselves without workers. They tried to stop the migration through intimidation and violence. They tried to stop labor recruiters from entering their counties. They tried to make it illegal for black people to leave. But they couldn't hold back the tide. Black families kept leaving. And as they left, they took their labor with them. They took their children. They took the future. The South had built its entire economy on the assumption black people would always be available to work for almost nothing. When that assumption proved false, the system collapsed. But the collapse was slow and incomplete. Sharecropping persisted in some areas into the 1960s and even 1970s. Debt peonage continued to trap families who couldn't escape. The criminal justice system kept targeting black men and boys, feeding them into prison labor systems. Direct descendants of convict leasing. The Great Migration didn't end oppression. It moved it. In northern cities, black families faced new discrimination. Redlining kept them out of certain neighborhoods. Job discrimination kept them in the lowest paying positions. Police brutality terrorized urban black communities just as white mobs had terrorized rural ones. The systems changed, but the fundamental reality remained: black people in America were not fully free. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s finally brought federal attention back to the conditions facing black Americans. The movement challenged segregation, demanded voting rights, and forced the nation to confront its racial hypocrisy. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were landmarks. They dismantled the legal structure of Jim Crow governing the South since Reconstruction. They gave black Americans tools to fight discrimination in courts and at ballot boxes. But these laws came nearly 100 years after the end of slavery. They came after multiple generations had been stolen through apprenticeship and convict leasing. They came after millions of families had been trapped in debt peonage and sharecropping. They came too late for those who had already lost everything. The question haunting this entire history is simple: what was lost? What did America take from black children through a century of exploitation? The answer is almost impossible to calculate, but we can estimate. Every child who worked in fields instead of going to school lost years of education. Every family in debt peonage lost the opportunity to accumulate wealth. Every generation under these systems lost the chance to pass something better to their children. Economists have tried to estimate the value of stolen black labor. The numbers are staggering. By some calculations, the value of unpaid labor during slavery alone amounts to trillions in today's money. The labor stolen through convict leasing, debt peonage, and sharecropping adds billions more. This wealth didn't disappear. It was transferred. It went to white landowners, white companies, white families. It built fortunes that still exist today. The legacy of this theft is visible everywhere if you know where to look. The racial wealth gap in America is enormous. In 2022, the median white family had about $170,000 in wealth. The median black family had about $23,000. That's a gap of nearly 8 to 1. This gap didn't appear by accident. It was built deliberately over generations through systems designed to extract black labor without compensation and prevent black families from accumulating wealth. Every black child taken under apprenticeship laws represented labor stolen from a family that couldn't afford to lose it. Every black family trapped in sharecropping represented wealth flowing upward to white landowners. Every black man caught in convict leasing represented profit extracted through state violence. The racial wealth gap is not a mystery. It's the predictable result of deliberate policy, choices made over more than a century. What does justice look like after 150 years of injustice? This is the question America has avoided for its entire history. After the Civil War, there were proposals to provide formerly enslaved people with land and resources. General William Tecumseh Sherman's Special Field Orders No. 15, issued in January 1865, set aside 400,000 acres of land along the coasts of South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida for formerly enslaved families. Each family was to receive 40 acres. Some also received army mules. This is where the phrase 40 acres and a mule comes from. For a brief moment, it seemed the nation might actually provide black people the means to build independent lives. But after Lincoln's assassination, President Andrew Johnson reversed the order. The land was taken back and returned to former Confederate owners who had committed treason against the United States. The promise was broken almost as soon as it was made. Since then, the question of reparations has surfaced again and again. In 1890, a bill was introduced in Congress to provide pensions to formerly enslaved people. It failed. In the 20th century, organizations formed to demand compensation for slavery. They were ignored. In 2019, the House held hearings on H.R. 40, a bill to establish a commission to study reparations. The bill has been introduced in every Congress since 1989. It has never passed. The debate over reparations is complex, but the historical record is clear. America made specific promises to black people and broke them. America allowed specific systems of exploitation to operate for nearly a century after slavery ended. America benefited economically from these systems, while black families suffered. Whether this creates a legal or moral obligation to provide compensation is a question America has refused to answer. What is not debatable is what happened. The apprenticeship system took children from their parents and forced them into unpaid labor. This happened. The convict leasing system arrested black men and boys on false charges and worked them to death in mines and fields. This happened. Debt peonage and sharecropping trapped millions of black families in cycles of poverty lasting generations. This happened. These were not isolated incidents by rogue individuals. They were systems. They were policies. They were laws written by legislators, enforced by courts, defended by the entire apparatus of state power. And they operated in plain sight while the rest of America chose not to see. The children at the center of this story never got to tell their side. Oni Cunningham, the 9-year-old girl bound as an apprentice in 1865, left no memoir. The children of Nathan and Jenny Cox, taken by their former enslaver, left no testimony. The young boys who died in coal mines under convict leasing left no letters. The girls who grew up in sharecropping cabins, working fields instead of learning to read, left no diaries. Their silence is the greatest tragedy. We know what happened only through records kept by their oppressors' court documents, contracts, ledgers, business records. The victims' voices are almost entirely lost. But not entirely. Some survivors did speak. Some testimonies were recorded. In the 1930s, as part of the Federal Writers Project, interviewers traveled across the South collecting stories from elderly, Black Americans who had lived through slavery and its aftermath. These interviews, the slave narratives, provide rare first-hand accounts. Many interviewed were children during slavery or just after. They remembered the apprenticeship system. They remembered convict leasing. They remembered sharecropping and debt peonage. They remembered watching their parents struggle against systems designed to crush them. Their words survive as a testament to what was endured and overcome. One woman interviewed in Alabama in 1937 recalled how her family was trapped in sharecropping after the war. She remembered her father working year after year, never getting ahead, always owing more than he made. She remembered her mother crying at night, worried how they'd survive winter. She remembered being sent to the fields as a child, her education sacrificed to help the family's desperate situation. She remembered all of this clearly. Though it happened 70 years before, the trauma didn't fade. It became part of who she was, part of her family's story, part of America's story, whether America wanted to acknowledge it or not. We are now at the end of this journey, through 150 years of hidden history. We began with a photograph of a child in a cotton field in 1932. We asked how this could be possible. 67 years after slavery ended, now we have the answer. Slavery did not end in 1865. It transformed, it adapted, it found new names and new legal justifications. It became apprenticeship, convict leasing, debt peonage, sharecropping. It operated through courts, contracts, sheriffs, and ledgers. It changed form, but kept its essential nature, the extraction of black labor, without fair compensation, the separation of black families, the denial of black children's futures. The system survived because powerful people wanted it to survive. It died slowly, reluctantly, only when black people themselves escaped it through migration, resistance, and unrelenting struggle. The children stolen under the apprenticeship system. The boys worked to death under convict leasing. The families trapped for generations in sharecropping. They are all part of American history. They helped build this country. Their labor created wealth that white families inherited and passed down. Their suffering made possible comfortable lives others enjoyed. They are owed not just acknowledgement, but justice. What form that justice should take is a question for the living. But the first step is knowing. The first step is understanding what really happened. The first step is refusing to accept the comfortable lie that slavery ended in 1865 and everything after was fair and equal. This story is not over. The descendants of those children are alive today. They carry the legacy of what was done to their ancestors in their family histories, in their economic circumstances, in their very bodies. The trauma of family separation echoes through generations. The poverty created by stolen wages and stolen opportunities persists in communities across America. The systems that targeted black children for exploitation have evolved into new forms: the school to prison pipeline, mass incarceration, environmental racism, predatory lending. The names change, the mechanisms change, but the fundamental pattern, the extraction of value from black lives, while denying black people full participation in American prosperity. That pattern continues. What will we do with this knowledge? That is the question confronting every American who learns this history. We can look away, as Americans have for generations. We can tell ourselves it was long ago, that times have changed, that we bear no responsibility for what happened before we were born. We can let the comfortable lies continue. Or we can face the truth. We can acknowledge what was done. We can understand how the past created the present. We can work toward a future where no child, regardless of color, is stolen from their family, denied their education, or forced to labor for someone else's profit. The choice is ours. It has always been ours, and the children whose stories we have told are waiting to see what we will decide. The photograph from 1932 still exists. You can find it in archives, in history books online. That little girl looks back at us across nearly a century. She never got to tell her own story. She probably never learned to read. She probably spent her whole life in those fields, or in domestic service, or in some other labor that paid almost nothing. She was free under the Constitution. She was enslaved by the system. She was one of millions, and she deserves to be remembered. They all deserve to be remembered, not as statistics, not as abstractions, but as children, as human beings, as Americans who were denied the promise of their own country. Remember them, learn their stories, and then decide what kind of country you want America to be. This is the history hidden for 150 years. Now you know. The question is what you will do with that knowledge. The children are watching. The ancestors are watching. History is watching. And the future is waiting